Cutting waste and advancing science are not partisan issues. No one wants to throw money down the drain, and we'd all like to see more diseases cured and more technological breakthroughs come to fruition. But defining waste and figuring out which project deserves federal funding, that's a bit more complicated. President Donald Trump has his ideals, and he's not afraid to go after programs that do not fit into his vision. An executive order signed back in August vowed to keep officials from, quote, wasting taxpayer dollars on frivolous grants. In that order, the White House claimed that grants had funded drag shows in Ecuador, training in critical race theory, and developing transgender sexual education programs. Specific details in those cases were not given. We do know that thousands of grants for the National Institutes of Health were frozen, disrupting research into cancer and other diseases. A piece posted by Nature looked over the status of scientific research and its workforce a year into Trump's second term. They found that 7,800 grants had been terminated or frozen, 25,000 scientists or personnel gone from agencies overseeing research, and proposed budget cuts amounting to $32 billion. And while courts have reinstated thousands of grants, the future of those projects remains uncertain. Dan Garisto is one of the three authors behind this piece. A physics journalist, Dan shares with us the biggest findings and their potential impact on America's scientific community. That conversation is next.
Today's episode is brought to you by Hamamatsu Corporation, a leading manufacturer of devices for the generation and measurement of infrared, visible, UV light, and X-rays. Hamamatsu is dedicated to the advancement of photonics through extensive research and offers specialized systems for select applications. Visit hamamatsu.com to learn more.
From Photonics Media, this is All Things Photonics, a podcast where we explore industry-shaping advancements in lasers, optics, imaging, metrology, and sensing. Each episode, we'll speak with some of the brightest minds in industry and research about the trends shaping the landscape of photonics.
Joining me right now is Dan Garisto, freelance physics journalist and one of the three authors behind a piece published by Nature titled U.S. Science After a Year of Trump. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Joe.
So talk to me about what you found, the biggest findings in your research going into this, and what the status of scientific research is today versus before Trump began his second term.
So I want to be clear that I'm only one of the three authors, and we also worked with Kim Albrecht, who was an expert in data visualization. And I focused on some of the large cuts to federal science agencies like the NSF, like the DOE. And what we found there was maybe not surprising to anybody that's been following the news, but I think striking when you look at the historical data, which shows that even during the first Trump administration, the federal agencies didn't really lose many people. There was a little bit of attrition, but no agency ever lost more than about 3 or 4% of its staff over any 1 year. And what we found is that basically every single agency lost between 15 to 25% of every science agency lost about 15 to 25% of their staff. Those were based on numbers that were available in September of 2025. Some of the numbers, the newest numbers out, show that those it's actually about 30% at some agencies. So yeah, I mean, one of the largest findings, one of the largest changes, I would say, between both the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration is this dramatic attrition of the federal scientific workforce. And that matters not just for people who are in the workforce, but for people who depend on the workforce for grants or for anything else that the federal government is doing.
In an executive order from President Trump in August, he, calls a lot of the grant process frivolous, and he says, they're essentially they're waste of money, going to far left initiatives, and this is directly from his executive order. Is there anything to kind of substantiate or add merit to kind of the grant process before maybe being wasteful or giving grants to areas that, I guess, as he said, don't reflect American ideologies?
Well, okay. Let me first start off with the allegations about waste, fraud, and abuse. Um, there are frequent audits of federal grants. Those take place within the agencies and outside the agencies. Um, and uh, one of the major ways that an agency, for example, like the National Science Foundation, audits their grants and makes sure that everything is okay, is that they have have had a team of scientists working under the Office of the Inspector General to look for fraud. This is also the case at NIH and other agencies where they make sure that these grants are, essentially working correctly, and that actually has been disrupted. There have been, at NSF in particular, all of the scientists who've been working on this um, are no longer funded. So these watchdog roles that agencies take to make sure that there is not waste, fraud, and abuse um, has actually been greatly diminished. The second thing I would say about whether or not there are, grants that don't align with the president's ideologies. Uh, every president has the power to appoint, political appointees to lead agencies and set agency priorities. Um, that happened during the first Trump administration. It happens during Democratic and Republican administrations. What is different this time is two things. One is that the government under the Trump administration has mass terminated uh, federal grants to, how do I say this? Has mass terminated federal grants for a variety of reasons, but in many cases, simply because someone is in a state that did not vote for President Trump, or at an institution which had protests that the Trump administration does not approve of. In some cases, grants were terminated because they had language. Uh, for example, grants supporting HIV research or grants supporting COVID research. So, I mean, these are ways that the Trump administration has targeted pre-existing grants, so essentially contracts, and terminated them. And that's there is no precedent for this um, in the government. Um, so I don't know if that fully answers your question. But in general, I would say that the Trump administration's aim has been to uh, exercise a great deal of control over the federal grant making process, really centralizing government and exerting authority over things that were, typically sort of handled by career scientists, career government officials, and not subject to partisan political behavior.
Gotcha. Yeah, and going back to those orders, he cites a lot of studies. Um, Grants went, and this is again quoting from the executive order. National Science Foundation grants went to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other far left initiatives. And those are kind of some of the grants that he kind of specifically is mentioning that he's considering wasteful and that he wants to cut funds from. You mentioned a moment ago too that there are audits in place to find fraud and to kind of validate the science being done. Was there any? Has there been any kind of mass scale finding of there's a whole lot of fraud, there's a whole lot of waste that would, support the need to pull back money?
Well, so the first thing I would say is that it is part of the NSF's congressionally approved mission since 1980 to provide funding for what they call broadening participation. Essentially, in 1980 and pretty much every couple of years since then, Congress has told the NSF, make sure that your science funding, make sure that more women, more people of color, other underrepresented minorities have opportunities in science. Um, And this is some of the funding which has been called wasteful. One of the areas with the largest number of terminated grants was at the NSF and at other science agencies, has been grants which provide funding for underrepresented groups. For example, one of the a large grant which was cut was a grant that was helping Hispanic students in the Chicago area get get some additional extra training to become engineers. These are grants that are aimed at bolstering the STEM workforce. And a lot of these grants. So you asked, was there an audit of this? Yes, there was. In a sense, the Senate Majority Committee. Well, then it was the Minority Committee, but basically, Senator Ted Cruz led a study into the NSF's granting of, things which are they refer to them as woke, leftist, neo-Marxist, but essentially grants that the Trump administration would take an ideological issue with. They found 3,400 grants out of about, I think, 50,000 or something like that. And the way that they did this was a keyword search for terms that would be flagged, things like women, bias, diversity. Now, the problem with this, as you might guess, is that you're going to catch a lot of stuff which is not particularly, one is congressionally mandated, but two, diversity also appears in phrases like biodiversity. Black appears in phrases like black hole. In one case, one of the words that they flagged was female leopard seals. There was a study about female leopard seals that was flagged. So, yes, there have been people who have looked at this. I would say that if you were going to, so this 3,400 number is actually larger than the number of grants which NSF, under the direction of Doge, terminated. I believe that number is about 1,700. Many of those have been reinstated, but if you want to get an idea of how many grants have even the Trump administration has pointed to as being problematic in this way, you could look at that 1,700 number.
Interesting. And speaking of numbers, this piece in Nature that does a great job in an infographic of kind of breaking down the changes financially, number of positions. I want to go through a few stats listed in that. 7,800, I believe, research grants terminated or frozen.
Mm-hmm.
25,000 professionals gone from agencies and agencies that do overview, and 32 billion in budget cuts. What is how do we get these numbers? And truly, there must be so much to comb through that. But how do we land on these numbers?
Well, I'll start with the budget one. That's sort of easy enough because you can there are robust ways of looking at both the budget and also how much money is dispersed to agencies. Just for some context, with that 33 billion number, the annual U.S. R&D funding for defense and non-defense is around 200 billion. So this is a large number. It is it is substantial. This is it's not a drop in the bucket even for the U.S., which is one of the world's largest research and development, or funders science, research, development, technology, all of it. The second number about the number of staff, a lot of this is public, and I should say that the Office of Personnel Management has actually updated their website to make it even more accessible. They have a big number up front. You can see it. They proudly display there are, I think it's 230,000 to 300,000 fewer federal workers than there were prior to the start of the Trump administration. So the challenge there then is just breaking it down by agency and figuring out who left. There was also, right after we wrote this story, there was a release of data by OPM, which shows the breakdown by degree level. And what there was some very nice reporting in Science about how many PhDs in particular left the government. There is some amount of churn every year. It's a couple thousand. Last year, 10,000 PhDs left the government. And then the final number, this grants number, this is one of the most difficult numbers. So in the aggregate, it's not so difficult to say, okay, they terminated 500 grants here, the Trump administration terminated 600 grants there. You know, one can collect these things. There are a number of initiatives doing this kind of tabulation. The one that we work with is called Grant Witness, and this is it's sort of I guess they're a nonprofit now, but it was essentially a volunteer effort done by concerned scientists to crowdsource and also get information from agencies themselves, because there's typically the agencies that are sending these termination letters to individual scientists, to institutions. I mean, for example, I've seen the letters that were sent to Harvard. I've seen letters that were sent to other researchers on just an individual basis. And if you collect all of that, you can find it. You can come up with a number for how many grants that the government terminated. The really tricky part is figuring out who got their money back, and how many grants were really reinstated. Because, just for example, you could have a grant reinstated, but then essentially not be able to apply for a continuation on that grant because all the members of your lab have left. This is I know this is the case with a number of people. There are people who were on soft money jobs. This is particularly common for public health, where there are a lot of grants to go around, but people just essentially they need that grant money to be employed. They don't have a typical amount of funding from the university, and some of them left their jobs or otherwise quit. And so okay, great, you got your grant reinstated, but you no longer have a job at the place where your grant was. What does that actually mean, right? So those are some of the difficulties in really assessing. We try to give a broad sense of what the damage was, but it's actually breaking it down and really getting into the fine details is very tricky, and a consequence of how sweeping and how quickly the Trump administration's changes have been made.
Interesting. And when gaining data from the White House, has there been any changes to how you receive that information from those federal authorities?
Well, so it depends. When we're talking about terminating grants, that's not coming from the White House. We are getting that from, in some cases, Grant Witness. In some cases, I have received numbers from institutions which have had terminated grants. I also, I have sources at federal agencies who have passed me lists of terminated grants. So with that, there's not a ton of transparency. We know that they are keeping track of some of the things that they're doing. I mean, there is a dashboard, a Doge dashboard. I don't know how updated that still is. It's not very easy to search, so it's it's not really the way one would like to go about it, but you can use it. to track some of these terminations that I know journalists have. Um, in general, I would say that the White House is, and most, this is not abundantly new to the Trump administration. Most White Houses are not very transparent. The differences in what they've been doing, and again, I want to say that these grant terminations are unprecedented. The way that presidents shape private, and as a result, many of them have been ruled illegal by numerous federal judges. The way that presidents legally typically shape agency priorities is by appointing someone to be head of an agency, and that person says, "Okay, we would like to focus on AI. We would like to focus on, I don't know, uh, you know, bioweapons, something like that." I mean, this is a very typical way to, going forward, we would like grants in these areas.
And going back to, you mentioned a pushback from federal courts. There are literally dozens of scientific groups, and we know this past September, about 50 scientific societies, including SPIE, which our audience will know for their photonics and optics connection, sent a letter to Congress expressing concerns over cuts. Have we been seeing any sort of pushback from lawmakers or from groups to try and swing the grant funds to returning, or any sort of change in that direction?
Well, so the main pushback is that Congress rejected the cuts to science agencies. I mean, the Trump administration had proposed things like a 40% cut for NIH. I believe it was a 13% cut for DOE, 57% cut for NSF. Pretty much all of the agencies have had basically flat funding. So Congress rejected that, and there was, I'm sure, a great deal of lobbying um, going on behind the scenes. Uh, with regard to the terminated grants, there were some efforts to introduce riders to bills that would have reinstated some of them, but those did not really get off the ground. And I honestly couldn't tell you why, but it is interesting. Okay. Here is here is what I would say. I think that there are processes which Congress is very comfortable doing. The things like setting out a budget, uh, which people can be persuaded to do to fall into those rhythms. Things like overturning an unprecedented presidential action. Um, that's less within their comfort zone, even though people have pointed out that essentially what the result of these, or the consequence of these terminations, is not just to the scientists, but it is to Congress, which has the power of the purse from Article One, because these are congressional appropriations. These are congressionally mandated funds, which the agencies, you know, are tasked with executing. Um, but then to take them away en masse is a form of impoundment of funding. So that's sort of where Congress comes into it. Is that they have pushed back in some normal ways, but in other ways, yeah, there has not been a ton of pushback.
Yeah, and it's been talked about and debated widely exactly the extent of the power of the executive branch, and Congress controlling the purse is something we learn kind of in basic history class. But there's some, I guess, debate over like I said, the extent of the power of the executive branch. And do cuts like this typically kind of come from Congress, or is this like new, I guess, to see from an executive order that kind of bypasses Congress and just says we're cutting these funds?
Um, well, so the president always releases a presidential budget request, and honestly, most of the time Congress ignores it. It factors in, but it's the Congress is the one deciding the budget. Um, and so, when you talk about cuts, that's true with respect to budget cuts. When you talk about terminations, well, uh, again, we haven't had uh, mass terminations of federal grants. It's not a thing. It doesn't exist. It hasn't been in science. It's it's sort of like uh, to use an analogy, it's sort of like uh, you know evicting everyone from their apartment building, right? There are evictions, they take place. Some of them are lawful. I have covered federal grants which have been terminated or frozen because of misconduct. There are there are there are reasons, there are mechanisms when there is waste, fraud, and abuse to eliminate federal grants. That is not the process that happened here. Um, so yeah, that's what I have to say about those kinds of terminations.
And now with all these cuts in place that have been in place, can we kind of picture what the long-term impacts are going to be from these cuts? You must have spoken with some researchers. Is it possible for anyone to make up lost time or lost funds, or to kind of get back on track?
Yeah, on an individual level, I think absolutely. I think there are a lot of people who, just for example, UCLA had their funding paused. I think it was only for about a month or so. Um, but and so I it may have been even less time. I think that in many cases, okay, people have some amount of you know there is essentially they have more money that they could draw down, um, because the money is dispersed. And so, many people may not have even felt it from that financial perspective. But what I want to say is that a lot of the damage is caused by the uncertainty. So, one of the first things we saw long before there was even a budget, this is a result largely of the potential for the cap on indirect costs. These are the overhead costs which are paid to universities and also private labs. There was, the government planned to, across a number of agencies, limit that to about 15%. And I know at universities, at least, the number is typically around 50%. So this would have been a loss of billions of dollars. And what we saw from that before the policy was even enacted, before court battles were fought on this, is that a number of universities rescinded PhD offers. These were often informal, but I spoke with students who had great conversation or effectively admitted, and then programs said we can't support them. And that uncertainty, didn't just stop last February or March. It continues, and I think that we see that in Harvard, for example, which has won its court case but continues to be targeted by the Trump administration. Uh, there, I believe their numbers for PhDs have been essentially halved. They are accepting far fewer PhD students because they simply don't know if they will be able to, pay for these PhD students for the next, 5 years or whatever the cycle is. I think 5 years is just a general assumption for most fields, but yeah, I mean that's the level that they're thinking about. Um, when you talk about what the consequences will be, there are different timescales for things. One of the most immediate consequences is, and we this was, I believe, one of the final charts in our story about 1 year of Trump. International students. The numbers of international students coming to the U.S. have dropped last year by about 17%. The total number of international students is still relatively stable, but that has to do with the fact that There was a bump after the pandemic, and many people stay for, it's called OPT, it's this optional practical training, basically trying to stay in the country and work after their graduate or undergraduate degree is done. Uh, so, but international students, this is an immediate shock to the system where you have tens of thousands fewer coming, and that's just that's a result of Trump administration policies, which are explicitly designed to deter them. And that is the kind of thing which colleges and universities will feel. There are many colleges and universities that will have funding shortfalls because they require that is their business model. They require international students to essentially stay afloat. Um, Now, I should say that many colleges and universities, places like NYU, which have a lot of international students, um, the international students are still going there because there is a huge demand to go to a place like NYU. If you are a less prominent institution, you may have not as good luck. Um, on the sort of far end of the spectrum, on the longer term, something like 10, 20 years down the road, yeah, there could be serious impacts on the number of patents produced by the U.S., the number of drugs that are being developed. Uh, these kinds of things take a long time because science takes a long time. Um, really may not know, and it may be difficult. It's sort of like you know a change to the climate. How does that impact a weather event? You know, 15 years down the road, those kinds of attribution studies exist, but they're not trivial. Um, I think a big signal will be in a couple of years if we see fewer PhDs, or when we will see, I think, fewer PhD students graduating, and those a dip there will be indicative of uh, how much or how little the science and research community recovered from the Trump administration's policies.
Talking about the dip in kind of student enrollment, if we lose foreign students who may not be looking to come to America, uh, is there any chance that that could be offset by students in America, American born, who may have an opportunity that they didn't before? Is that possible to offset that?
Uh, well, it still wouldn't offset the funding issues felt by many universities. That foreign students pay much more than students in the U.S. or students who are in state. Uh, in terms of opportunities, um, well, the I guess I would say maybe, but it sure doesn't look very good given the way that colleges and universities are closing many of their programs, are reducing their admittance. I don't think that it's reasonable to say that students in the U.S. have a better opportunity now, that there are fewer foreign students coming.
Hmm. Interesting, and what naturally this study and your work focuses on a lot of cuts, which we're seeing across the board. Did you find any areas where scientific research was left uh, untouched, or even saw any sort of benefit? Are because the White House talks about we want to invest in things for our American ideologies, however, exactly they want to word it.
Yeah,
Are there areas that they found that fit that they maybe invested more in, or at least they said, let's not touch investment here?
yeah, and this is very clear at a place like NSF, for example. The president's budget. So this was, their plan was to have, I think it was about 3% increase for AI and machine learning. There was a small bump for geothermal energy at the Department of Energy. That might have actually been more than a small bump. I can't remember the exact numbers. there and continues to be support for quantum technology. Um, the first Trump administration led to the National Quantum Initiative. Um, so yeah, I mean, there are absolutely um, areas which the Trump administration has prioritized, um, and there is some funding being directed there. Fusion is another one. I don't, again, have the numbers in front of me, but these are stated priorities. Um, what I would say though is that I think that there are two big questions for people for the Trump administration and for people who are looking to benefit from funding in these areas. The first is, are we sure that the funding can actually be delivered in a reasonable and timely manner? The reason I say this is because it takes infrastructure to deliver funding, infrastructure that has been damaged as a result of many people leaving. Things like program officers, people who handle the even just the financial sort of nitty gritty side of this are not around. And there are questions about whether or not agencies will be able to get all of their grants out the door before the end of the year. Uh, so that's one aspect. The second thing is, are there any riders that you're uncomfortable with? So one of the things which has been pushed, this is not as much by the Trump administration, but it has been by Republican members of Congress, are things around research security. So there was a SAFE Act, which was essentially would have targeted any person who has worked with a researcher in China over the past 5 years and would have made them possibly ineligible for federal funding. Um, a lot of people have worked with someone in China over the past 5 years. Um, these kinds of riders or restrictions are uh, not in place at the moment, but they could be really serious restrictions on researchers who are looking to receive federal funding. Um, so I think, especially if you're doing something which is seen as particularly sensitive to national security or even just economic strategy, yeah, I think that that's something to look out for. Is kind of these kinds of restrictions and these kinds of this kind of scrutiny on researchers who are looking for funds.
So we've talked about a lot of the personnel impact between bringing foreign researchers here, or even researchers here who had connections, however close or loose, to foreign parties. What are these cuts doing to America's place in the scientific research community? I mean, because we're talking about possibly losing a lot of talented researchers. Is there are we seeing the impacts of a brain drain, so to speak, or our place leading, maybe once leading the world in scientific research, is now kind of, is it declining a little bit because of this?
Um, okay, there's a couple of components to this. The first one I would say, this is the easiest, is how does the rest of the world, how do other researchers look at the U.S.? I think it's very clear that people are concerned. Just as an example, last year I got asked by a union of Swedish faculty, postdocs, and graduate students to talk to them about what's going on in the U.S. I don't think I'm their typical speaker. So, there are concerns about what's going on in the U.S. because people work with those in the U.S. because the U.S. is still the scientific superpower, and because there are concerns about similar things happening where they are. We're seeing massive cuts in the UK right now. I believe it's 30% to physics. Really, really devastating stuff. And so, yeah, I think people I think the world is looking on apprehensively. In terms of brain drain, it is not very substantial. I, it's more than the first Trump administration. I think there's interest among researchers. Have have research talent will travel, right? But the reality is that there is no equivalent source of funding. You can't you can't do that kind of funding on the scale that the U.S. has. Um, and so what you end up having is a couple dozen researchers, leaving for France, for example. I mean, and that's it's like a $50 million program or something like that, just to recruit a couple dozen. So no, there has not been a considerable brain drain away from researchers who are already established in the U.S. Um, One thing you should look for, and I don't think we have this statistics on this, is uh, U.S. citizens who are studying abroad and they become placed abroad. But that strikes me as a far more likely than people who have tenure or are otherwise extremely established. Um, Leading en masse. Uh, and then the final thing I would say about the U.S.'s place in the world is that this has really nothing to do with the Trump administration. There's certainly not the current one. The world was already growing much more multipolar in terms of research capacity. China in particular has grown in leaps and bounds, and arguably in some areas I think is the world leader. Um, you know, that's probably just a natural thing, right? The
Mhm.
U.S. dominance, which has existed since World War II, um, which also coincides with the modern research university, the modern federal spending on science and technology, probably could not ever last. You know, could not last forever. Um, but I think it's undeniable that what's going on now will hasten the U.S.'s decline uh, from its lofty position. Um, but that said, uh, I guess I should say, as if it, since I've been sort of talking negatively, I think that the U.S. is still a place where a ton of great science and technology is done, can still be done, and likely will be done. Uh, you know, I probably wouldn't be saying that if a 57% cut had actually been passed at NSF. Um, but yeah, I think that there are reasons to be optimistic in the longer term about science and research in the U.S. In the meantime, things are not ideal, and there is still a lot of damage ongoing.
Right. Uh, Volatility is certainly kind of a trend that we see across the board right now in a whole lot of different areas. You mentioned some areas that had seen some maybe increase in budget. You mentioned quantum, you mentioned fusion energy, which I know my audience enjoys because those are photonic based. One thing, we've heard President Trump talk about concerns about semiconductors and about domestic production there. Now, a Biden era CHIPS Act sought to kind of grow funds there. Do we know if the semiconductor industry, the research there is being impacted as well from these lines of cuts?
Um, so I want to preface this by saying that I'm not a journalist who has done a ton of reporting on the semiconductor industry, but as a physics journalist and as someone who's covered policy, one of the interesting things to see has been uh, there have been a lot of public statements and dissatisfaction toward the CHIPS Act from the Trump administration because it is a Biden era policy. Um, However, uh, most my understanding is that most of the CHIPS Act's money is one has already, sort of kicked in terms of, massive increase in manufacturing. I mean, the public-private partnerships generated by the CHIPS Act were taking place long before Trump entered office. The second thing is that it's legislation. It was passed. It's very difficult to dismantle that by executive policy, and most of the actions that I have spoken about have taken place through the executive branch. Um, so, you know, yes, the Trump administration has been trying to claw back funds in a lot of areas. I am not aware of significant funds which have been clawed back from the CHIPS Act. That doesn't mean that they haven't been or they couldn't be, but my understanding is that the funding from the CHIPS Act will go forward. Now, there are other problems like tariffs, and I am sure that there are things which the administration could be doing which would increase the efficacy of the CHIPS Act in terms of helping the semiconductor industry in the U.S., which it is not doing with some of its policies. But yeah, my understanding is that the CHIPS Act is still alive and mostly well. Um, but I don't want to speak as authoritatively on this because it's
Sure.
something I've covered directly.
Sure. Yeah. No, I can understand and appreciate that. So my last question for you is if you can kind of summarize, in a brief few sentences, your findings from, U.S. science after a year of Trump, and if that gives you any insight to what you would expect for 2 years after Trump or year two under Trump's second term.
Yeah. Um, well, because there's a lot to say here, I'll try to stick to four main points. The first one is that I think there is a ton of damage to morale. This encompasses on the individual level, on the institutional level. This is where the uncertainty kicks in. That morale is still incredibly low, and that is going to have serious policy effects. The second thing is that the actual top line budget numbers. Congress did push back on that. We also have seen the courts push back on actions that have been ruled to be illegal by the Trump administration. So uh, there is a arguably more resistance here than in many other areas of Trump administration policies. In many other areas, the Republicans in the Senate and Congress are much more aligned with the Trump administration. But budgets are budgets, and budgets impact people across the country, and people feel the impact. And we have seen, I think, substantial pushback from people in the president's own party against many of these cuts to science and technology. And I think we will continue to see that, and it may even increase if after the midterms. The third thing is on the level of scientific achievement. Number of papers, patents, other things. That to me is I think we're just not going to know. We're not going to know in 2 years or even 5 years. I know, in fact, that there are economists, there are people who are sociologists of science who are, looking at this as wow, this is a hell of a case study. People have found impact even from just for example, the government shutdown in 2013 led to a disruption in Antarctic research because it happened in right around the time when researchers go down to the Antarctic because the Antarctic summer is our fall. Anyways, and it led to a noticeable decrease in publications from researchers who needed to go down there. And that did not kick in immediately. It took several years to kick in. But yeah, I think we will see, we will see people trying to study and understand what the impacts of this are. And then the final thing, I want to say is that this is not a specific thing, but this is a word of caution to myself, to anybody who's making prognostications. It is, the level of uncertainty is really, really hard. Makes it really, really hard to predict anything. And so I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody has a crystal ball. I think that, in many ways, despite all the actions that this administration has taken, it has fewer plans than a typical administration. We haven't seen as much turnover as in the first Trump administration, but it has been a chaotic time, and I think it will continue to be a chaotic time. And so, I just the last thing I want to say is, I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows, but we'll continue to pay attention.
That's fair. It seems one of the few certainties is uncertainty, right?
Yes.
Dan Garisto, freelance physics journalist and one of the 3 authors behind a piece published by Nature, U.S. Science After a Year of Trump. Dan, thank you so much for giving me your time and your insight on this topic. We really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Appreciate it.
With that, we conclude another episode of All Things Photonics. Thank you to our sponsors, to the technical staff behind the scenes, and to continued support from the Photonics Media editorial team. As always, questions, comments, thoughts, and ideas are welcome. Let us know how we're doing via email at allthings@photonics.com. All Things Photonics is available on all major platforms and on our website, photonics.com.